The wars of Israel and the wars of the United States, the wars that the United States fights and the wars that Israel fights, are very different. The United States mobilizes troops. The United States goes with a high-scale invasion in Vietnam or Iraq, even these days in Afghanistan. Israel can't afford to have wars like that. Israel is a small country. Israel fights today in the same way that we used to fight in the days of King David. Israel goes into massive operations, very tough, very destructive, into their enemy camp, and then they come back. The longest war that Israel fought was probably the Yom Kippur War, and right before that was the Six-Day War. 6 days of war against three enemies, three fronts. Israel had to fight quickly. Israel had to mobilize the resources from one front to the other. Join me in this map that I have here with me. I want to show you, in the Six-Day War, Israel was fighting in two fronts. Israel was fighting against Egypt. This is the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And Israel was fighting one front here, and Israel used some troops on this front. But then Israel had to fight against Jordan on the west, on this other front. Israel is on the west of Jordan. And Israel have to use the same troops that they use against Egypt on the front against Jordan. And the third front was the front against Syria in the north, Damascus. So Israel has three fronts, and Israel cannot invade territory. The United States goes with air carriers, invade territory, move troops. They launch tremendous operations. Israel has to fight very, very fast, very quickly. And this is exactly the way that King David used to fight when David fought the enemies of Israel. David actually will try to weaken the neighbors of Israel so they will not come inside the territory of Israel. In the Six-Day War, Israel had to weaken Egypt so Egypt will not come inside the territory of Israel. And the way the Six-Day War was really defined in the first 45 minutes. 1967, Israel looked for help in the United States. The United States says, do not preempt an attack. Do not attack the Egyptians first. If you attack the Egyptians first, you will attack alone. Abba Eban from Israel came to Washington. United States said, you will not go alone unless you decide to be alone, if you attack first. A second delegation of Israel came to the United States, and Washington said, do not attack first. And Israel knew Israel had to attack first. Otherwise, Egypt would have attacked from the south, Jordan from the east, and Syria from the north. When Israel knew that he was surrounded on three fronts, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, in the Jewish world, the Jewish community started talking about Auschwitz again, about the concentration camp. Israelis said, if we are attacked by these three countries at the same time, we will be destroyed. We cannot wait to be attacked by three countries on three fronts. We can only divert troops. So Israel attacked very toughly Egypt. In 45 minutes, the Israeli Air Force destroyed all the Egyptians' runways. The very first operation, that Israel had 180 airplanes that they have to fight. Only 8 planes remained in Israel. 180 French-built Mirage airplanes have to fly over Egypt. Some went all the way over the territory of Egypt, and some went around into the Sinai Peninsula. 180 airplanes flying all together into Egyptian territory. The very first task was to destroy the Egyptian runways. Egypt had runways all along the continent of Egypt and in the Sinai Peninsula, several runways. And the very first thing was for Israel to destroy the runways, so the Air Force of Egypt couldn't take off. And then the planes on the ground have to be destroyed. Some of the planes took off, but most of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground before they were even allowed to take off. And that operation that lasted 45 minutes marked the outcome of the war. Because without Egyptian Air Force, Israel destroyed all the Air Force of Egypt in 45 minutes. This is exactly the way that David used to fight, King David used to fight his fights. Remember against Goliath. One stone, the very first stone, hit Goliath. That was the victory. That marked the victory. Remember the other fights, David had to be very tough in the beginning, and the outcome of the fight was decided. Once Israel destroyed the runways, then the rest of the Air Force of Israel have to destroy the planes on the ground. The planes, the Egyptian airplanes, have no cover. Many of the pilots were still seated in the cockpits. And Israel destroyed all the Air Force. Without Air Force, Egypt had in Sinai, in the Sinai Desert, Egypt had 3 times as many tanks as Israel had. Israel only had a few tanks. Egypt had 3 times as many tanks as Israel tanks. And the Egyptian tanks were advancing to invade Israel's soil. Now, without Egyptian air cover, the Egyptians couldn't protect their tanks. And the Air Force, after destroying the runways and the planes, the Air Force of Israel surrounded the Sinai Peninsula, and the Israeli tanks advanced. The Egyptians knew they couldn't defend themselves, and they ordered the retaliation. They ordered to return and to bring the tanks back across the Suez Canal, back to Cairo, across the Suez Canal. Once the tanks turned around and they tried to go back, Israelis chased Egyptian tanks. It was a disaster for Egypt. Israel destroyed, you see here in this map, the ancient roads, which are still the roads, today's roads, on the Sinai Peninsula. Israel just chased the Egyptian tanks that were trying to go across the canal, and Israel destroyed all the Egyptian tanks in a few hours. The first day, in a few hours, the Air Force, the runways of Egypt, the Air Force of Egypt, and now the infantry, the tank of Egypt were all destroyed. Egypt was not a threat to Israel anymore. A few days before, the Egyptians were threatening Israel that they will enter into Israel's soil, come all the way to Tel Aviv, and push the Jews into the water. A few days before, Israel was worried, and the whole Jewish community around the world was afraid that we will witness a new Holocaust, a new Auschwitz. We will be surrendered by being attacked on 3 fronts. In 45 minutes, in a couple of hours later on with the tanks, the outcome of the war was decisive. Once Israel defeated Egypt very quickly, very toughly, like King David used to do, once Israel defeated Egypt, now all the troops were diverted in order to protect Israel from its eastern neighbor, from Jordan. And that is going to be another front on the 6-day war. I have some images that I want you to see. I would like you to watch carefully those images on how the Air Force operated, the Israeli Air Force, how they moved, how they attacked and destroyed the Egyptian Air Force in only 45 minutes. Let's watch this. I think you will see God's hand over the Israeli Air Force in this operation. We'll be back in a moment.
The Chief of Staff and I took a decision. On the night of June 4th, we would sleep at home. The tom-toms in Israel work like in the jungle. If the Chief of Staff and Air Force Chief both come home, word gets round that tomorrow is going to be quiet. That was the commander's bedtime message.
Leaving behind only 12 fighters to defend Israel, 180 aircraft took off for Egypt. Their target was 45 minutes away.
We observed total radio silence. We flew at the height of the waves for about 15 minutes. We flew low over the sand dunes. We crossed the Suez Canal at Kantara and entered the delta. As we flew over the delta, farmers waved to us. They probably thought we were Egyptian.
Most of the Israeli squadrons flew out to sea far to the west. They had extra fuel tanks to enable them to approach Egypt's air bases from an unexpected direction.
That was the longest 45 minutes in my life. The hands on my watch didn't seem to move. They went very slowly.
As the Israeli bombers approached their targets, the Egyptians received a coded message from Jordan.
They spotted Israeli planes heading towards us. So they sent us a signal from their radar base to warn us. The signal was in code. Our codes had changed the day before, and we had real trouble decoding it.
The Ministry of Defense asked the air defense people what they had done with the signal they had received. It had the code word, grape. They replied, "What signal?"
At exactly 07:45, we pulled up to 6,000 feet. I looked down and saw the MiGs glinting on the edges of the runway. The pilots were sitting inside the cockpits. I knew we had caught them by surprise.
The Israelis began their attack by destroying the runways to prevent the Egyptian aircraft from taking off. The few that did get off the ground were no match for the Israeli fighters.
I got a call from one of the Air Force chiefs. He said, "Nofel, Nofel." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Our airfields are being attacked." I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He said, "Our airfields are being attacked." I said, "Our airfields?" He said, "The airfields in the Sinai are being attacked." I said, "All the Sinai airfields? Tell me it's not true." And he said, "Believe me, all the airfields are being attacked." I hung up. The phone rang again. It was another commander. He said, "We're being attacked." So I said to myself, well, something must be going on. But I was all alone.
He was alone because the head of the Egyptian armed forces, Marshal Amer, had left with the Minister of War and his top brass to inspect their positions in the Sinai.
10 minutes after takeoff, we heard about the Israeli attack. We turned round and flew back. Our cars had gone. We had to hail a taxi to get back to headquarters.
By the time Marshal Amer's taxi got him back to headquarters, Egypt's Air Force was destroyed.
Marshal Amer was panicking. He told the Air Force chief to implement the counterattack plan. The Air Force chief replied, "How can I? I have no aircraft."
This was just the air battle with the Egyptians. The war would last 6 days. This was the first 45 minutes. Now the Sinai Peninsula, I was mentioning, Sinai Peninsula, part of Egypt, was full of Egyptian tanks. And the tanks were ready to invade Israel. The tanks were there ready to invade Israel, but without air support, the tanks have no hope. Marshal Amir, the Egyptian commander that you will see, he asked the tanks to turn around and to go across the canal and to go back to Egypt. And Israel gave chase and destroyed all the Egyptian tanks in a few hours. Egypt was out of the picture, out of the threat in a few hours. A few days before, I was mentioning, we were really afraid that we would be attacked in 3 fronts and thrown into the water, that the Jewish state will disappear in 1967. 45 minutes, 45 incredible minutes, 45 King David's type of minutes. Remember the threat with Goliath. Remember the threat when Goliath used to come and insult Israel day after day? Remember the fear that David's friends, David's brothers, that the other soldiers felt. Remember when David heard the insults? If you were there, like the other soldiers, if I would have been there, you would have seen the consequences. You would have thought in the consequences. Well, a few days before the battle, the consequences were awful. All over the world, Jewish people thought, if we are attacked really the way they are saying in 3 fronts, now we will be destroyed. It's very interesting that Israel will destroy the Air Force of Egypt, the tanks. We will see the tanks in a moment. And right after that, all the troops that were fighting Egypt in the south, they have to be diverted in order to fight Jordan. Something that is difficult to understand is why Jordan waited while this fight was taking place. Jordan was beginning to move their soldiers west in order to push Israel into the water. Israel had enough time. Israel had to defeat Egypt very quickly, so the same troops, the same soldiers, the same planes, the same tanks could turn around and now face the Egyptian front, now face the Jordanian front. And after Jordan, the same soldiers, the same equipment have to face north in order to fight against Syria. It was a very tough war. It's going to be the greatest victory of Israel in 3,000 years, ever since King David. Let's look at the tanks in the Sinai Peninsula and how Israel, the roads that you will see are the same roads of ancient days, dust roads. There are roads in the desert that goes from Egypt to Israel. Those are the roads that took Joseph's brothers, Jacob, when they went to Egypt. Those are the roads that Moses took when he came back. Just paths, ancient paths in the middle of the desert. And now, in 1967, you will see the tanks in those roads. Pay attention on this and you will see now the infantry fighting in the Sinai Peninsula, Moses' territory. Back.
They had fought together as young officers. Together they had planned the coup which brought down the Egyptian monarchy. Now the defeated president phoned his defeated army commander.
I was the only other person there. Amer was in tears. He was calling Nasser by his first name. He said, "Let me bring our boys back safely, Gamal." When he put the phone down, I asked, "Why are you crying?" He told me Nasser had said, "Forgive me, Hakim. I caused this catastrophe. Forgive me, Hakim." Abdel Nasser had been crying too.
Marshal Amer didn't wait for his chief of staff to plan a retreat. He simply picked up the phone and gave the order himself.
بعد إشارة لانسحب
The order was, withdraw back across the canal. Leave the artillery behind.
Marshal Amer's order was a disaster. With no plan, his retreating units could not protect each other. The Israelis gave chase.
Our tanks had Egyptian tanks in front and behind them. We attacked them from the ground and from the air. Thousands were destroyed. They were all burning. It was a terrible sight.
338 Israelis were killed. But the Egyptian dead numbered 15,000. Days earlier, when the war had begun, the Israelis had contacted the King of Jordan.
Well, that was the Six-Day War, the first part of the Six-Day War. That was the battle against Egypt in the south. What you were looking at are the roads, the ancient roads, and the Egyptian army completely destroyed. It certainly revived all the story of Moses because of the geography. The geography has not changed. It's been 3,500 years since Moses, but the Sinai Peninsula is still the same Sinai Peninsula. What it did change was the canal. People talk about the canal. This is called the Suez Canal. This is the Red Sea, where Moses crossed. In the north of the Red Sea, the British and the French, in the early 1800s, they built the canal. The canal is called the Suez Canal and is the easiest path between Sinai and Egypt. To go to Cairo, you have to go through the canal. The canal is going to be very, very important. But of course, the next part of the story that we will watch next time, we'll have to explain next time, is not the war against Egypt. That will be dealt with. The Egyptians will have all their air force and tanks completely destroyed. The next part of the story is the war against Jordan. The war against Jordan, it will be from the attacks from the east. Jordan is right here. The war against Jordan, it will be a different war. It will be a different situation. It will be also as miraculous, if not more, than the war with Egypt, and basically because Jordan had the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem, the capital of King David's kingdom, the old city of Jerusalem, was part of Jordan. King Hussein, the king of Jordan, had all those territories. King Hussein, this map, this yellow part that you see is the map of Israel, but this will be the map of Israel after the Six-Day War. Before this war, there will be what we call the West Bank. It will be all these territories. This is the Jordan River, west of the Jordan, and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, will be part of Jordan. In this war, in this second part of the war that we will study next program in details, on this second part of the war, Israel moved east and conquered the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem will not bring us the memories of Moses. The city of Jerusalem will bring us the memories of David, really, because King David, the very first operation as a king for David, you remember well, David wanted to conquer Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a city that was never conquered. The Jebusites were living there. What is Jerusalem? Jerusalem is the city where it's a mountain. It's a couple of mountains, really. And in that mountain, in one of those mountains, is exactly the place where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. The first mentioning of Jerusalem, of Mount Moriah, is the sacrifice of Isaac. In that very place, Years later, centuries later, on that very place, in the high place of the mountain, that is where David wanted to build the temple for God. Well, it was Solomon the one who built the temple. But this territory is a place of the sacrifice of Isaac, Isaac's binding, and is a place of the temple. And is a place where David called it the capital of Israel. And in this war, it will be taken from Jordan. The word Jerusalem in Hebrew, the name in Hebrew Jerusalem is the word Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim ends with im. Everything in Hebrew that ends with im, it's a plural. Yad, hand, yadayim, hands. It's plural or it's infinite, like Elohim, the infinite God. The name is Yerushalayim, it's plural because there are two Jerusalems. One is this Jerusalem, the Jerusalem from the earth, but the other is the Jerusalem from heaven, the Jerusalem from height, Yerushalayim shel lemala. And there is always a connection. There's always a connection between the Jerusalem from heaven, from above, and the earthly Jerusalem. That connection, that is what was conquered in the 6 Day War. Yes, the war was against Egypt, but the war against Jordan was to possess the earthly Jerusalem. Once Israel is in the possession of the earthly Jerusalem, there is contact between heaven and earth. And we will continue next time. Shalom ubracha, peace and blessings. Next time we will study the war against Jordan. God bless you.